everybody. My name is Greg Brzezinski, and I am the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. And it's just, I'm very happy to see all of you here today. As you may know, the Seeger Center is the hub of Asian Studies scholarly activity at the GW campus. Our purpose is to expand the range of knowledge and expertise and improve the quality of research about Asia, and to promote dialogue between academics and policymakers about the major issues that face the Asian region today and in the future. Today's event, we actually have a great example of work on these kinds of topics. We are joined by our main speaker, Dr. Dawn Murphy, who we're very proud of is an alumna of our PhD political science program. She joined the Naval War College as an associate professor of national security strategy in 2022. Prior to joining NWC, her academic appointments included associate professor of international studies at Air War College, visiting professor of political science here at GW, and a postdoctoral research fellowship with the Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, China, and the World program. Her book, which is, she's going to be the main focus of her talk, looks at China's rise in the global South and focuses in particular on the Middle East and Africa. We are also joined today by our discussant, Professor David Shambaugh, who those of you who have been in our Asian studies or China studies programs here probably recognize, but he is of course an internationally recognized authority and award-winning author on contemporary China and the international relations of Asia. He is the Gaston Seeger Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science and International Affairs, and the founding director of the China Policy Program in the Elliott School of International Affairs. Please welcome Dr. Murphy and Professor Shambaugh. I will turn it over to you. You can, I guess you're going to use the podium. Yes.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? So first, thank you to Professor Shambaugh and to Professor Brzezinski for having me here today. It really is great to be back at the Elliott School, and I think this is the first time I've spoken at GW since I completed my PhD. So really excited to be here. And I also need to start with the disclaimer that the views I express today are my own. They do not represent the National War College, the Department of Defense, or the US government more broadly. And as has already been said, I'm going to be focusing on the book that came out last year. So the overall argument of the book is that although China does not seek to change the international distribution of territory in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, as its power grows, it increasingly competes with the US, builds spheres of influence in these regions, and challenges the rules of the international system by constructing an alternative international order to facilitate interactions. China does not yet seek to replace the existing international order. But if that order unravels or excludes China in various ways, this alternative order could serve as the foundation of China's economic, political, and military relations with the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the rest of the developing world. The book seeks to answer the following questions. What are China's interests in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa? Is China competing or cooperating with the US in these regions? Is its behavior converging or diverging from the liberal international order? Is it building an alternative international order? And if yes, what are some characteristics of that order? And ultimately, what does China's behavior in these regions indicate about its rise globally? First, before I start talking about the findings of the book, I think it's important to define a few terms. When I say Middle East, I'm referring to the League of Arab States, including North Africa, as well as Iran, Israel, and Turkey. And when I refer to sub-Saharan Africa, it's the rest of the continent outside of that. I don't use the terms revisionist or status quo oriented in my book or in my work, but for each foreign policy tool that I examine, I categorize them as competitive versus cooperative with the US, and convergent versus divergent with the liberal international order. And from a definitional standpoint, I won't go into all the different aspects of the liberal international order, because it really depends which foreign policy tool we're looking at, which aspect of the order is relevant. But just to flag for you, I am referring to broadly on the economic side, an economic order that emphasizes free markets and the lack of limited state involvement in the economy. And on the political side, advocacy for human rights, various political rights, and obviously the use of various international institutions for resolving security issues. The findings of the book are that as China's power grows, it is competing in the functional areas of economics and politics. And that behavior often, but not always, diverges from the liberal international order. In contrast, in the security realm, China is cooperating, and its behavior is mostly convergent with the liberal order. Also, China's perception of threat from the US amplifies its competitive and norm divergent behavior. So now, for the most part of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about China's interests, some of the foreign policy tools that are examined in the book with a particular emphasis on cooperation forums and special envoys. I'm going to say some words about where these tools fall in relation to competition versus cooperation and convergence versus divergence. I'm going to introduce you to how China portrays itself as a great power in these regions, and then provide some overall conclusions. One thing I should note is that my comments today are really related to China in the contemporary era, in the post-Cold War environment, and its behavior is quite different than it was in the Mao era. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, during the Mao era, China was providing material support to many national liberation movements globally throughout the global South, as well as promoting various aspects of ideology. But China's interests in the post-Cold War Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa now, and I consider these to be in rank order essentially. Right now, they are acquiring resources and markets to fuel China's own economic growth. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind. From my perspective, the markets that are in the Middle East for Chinese goods and services in a very wide range of sectors are just as important to China as the resources that they are able to gain from these regions. The second most important interest is fostering support for China in the international system in an era of either emerging multipolarity or bipolarity. And what I mean by fostering support, that could be in the United Nations, it could be in the G20, it could be in the WTO, it could be in relations with the African Union, it could be in many different informal groupings. But in general, the 53 states in Africa that recognize the PRC, as well as the countries in the Middle East, are important blocks of countries for supporting China on various issues. The next most important interest, and especially in relation to the Middle East, is ensuring China's own domestic stability, in particular regarding Xinjiang. And what I mean by this is they want to have relative silence from Muslim majority states regarding their behavior in Xinjiang. Ideally, if states will provide statements that demonstrate support for the way China's behavior, that would be great. But really, when you look over time, what they've been looking for is silence and a lack of criticism regarding Xinjiang. Another important interest is advocating for developing country causes. This ties in with the very long history that China has going all the way back to the Mao era of seeing itself as a leader of the third world, of the developing world, of the global South, and seeing that it has a role to play in advocating for countries that are part of this area of the world. The next interest is safeguarding China's citizens and businesses abroad. This has been a growing interest. If you think back to 2011, China had to evacuate out 35,000 of its citizens from Libya during the war there. You've had similar situations in Yemen, in Syria, in other environments. And China increasingly is concerned that its citizens and businesses could be targeted by terrorists, could be targeted by kidnappers, by various types of violence against them. And finally, and this is kind of a more emerging interest, but China wants to protect its own territorial integrity from the US. And what I mean by this is before 2010 or so, in general, China tended to approach the Middle East as a region, Africa as a region, different parts of Asia as a region, but it tended to be relatively siloed. Increasingly, you're seeing a desire from China for having support from Middle Eastern and African countries for its behavior in other regions. So for example, regarding its stance on the South China Sea, or its behavior in Hong Kong, or its ideals regarding non-intervention more broadly. So you're starting to see more of a desire to have support from countries in these regions. So those are China's interests. Next, I want to talk about the foreign policy tools that China uses to pursue these interests. And again, I'm going to spend the most time on the cooperation forums and special envoys, but I also will say a few words regarding kind of broader bilateral economic, political, and security relations. So the cooperation forums, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with these. The book looks in particular at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. So Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is referred to as FOCAC, it contains 53 states in Africa, so every state on the continent minus Eswatini that continues to recognize Taiwan. It meets every 3 years, and its last meeting was in 2021, and it was held in a virtual format during COVID. The China-Arab States Cooperation Forum was established in 2004, and FOCAC was established in 2000. So China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, established in 2004. It includes all of the members of the League of Arab States, and it meets every 2 years. Its last meeting was in December 2022, so December last year. If you remember, Xi Jinping went to Saudi Arabia for a bilateral meeting with the Saudi Arabian leadership, also to attend the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum that was held at a summit level, and also to attend a China Gulf Cooperation Council summit. But that was the last meeting. These two forums, when you look at North Africa, those countries are actually part of both of these forums. And what these forums are they are the primary multilateral coordination mechanisms that China utilizes to interact with the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. They encompass a broad range of issues: economic, political, foreign aid, security, but also many other issues that I won't talk about today: the environment and education and health. And if you think about pretty much any way in which two countries could interact, that falls technically within the scope of these cooperation forums. The political norms underlying the cooperation forums are the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, with a focus on sovereignty, non-intervention, and non-interference, as well as South-South cooperation. And in the Arab States Cooperation Forum, there's also an element that includes support for the Palestinians. And I should say, I talked earlier about the Mao era. During the Mao era, China was providing material support to various Palestinian groups. Ever since 1992, China has diplomatic relations with Israel and has very strong relations with Israel. But there's an expectation on the part of Arab states for China to demonstrate support for the Palestinians more broadly. So that does tend to manifest itself in the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. On the economic front, the economic norms underlying these forums are a heavy state involvement in trade, investment, and infrastructure. Foreign aid is also in these forums, and I think you guys are probably relatively familiar with this, but China has foreign aid that's provided without political conditionality other than recognizing the PRC, but with a lot of economic conditionality associated with using Chinese companies for concessional loans contracts as they're executed. On the security front, security cooperation is not a major emphasis of these forums, but when it is discussed, it's about peacekeeping and having nuclear-free zones and counterterrorism operations and those type of issues. The book does a deep dive on those two cooperation forums, and it also talks briefly about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in comparative perspective. And so I'm going to say a few words about that because the SCO is increasingly relevant for the Middle East as well. So the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, was established in 2001. It originally included China, Russia, and Central Asian states. It expanded over time to include India and Pakistan. In 2022, Iran became a formal member of the SCO, and Turkey has applied for membership. Also in 2022, you had Saudi, Egypt, and Qatar join as dialogue partners, and Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE have expressed interest in becoming dialogue partners. So you now have a situation where the SCO, when you look at the SCO and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, every country in the Middle East and Africa, except for Israel, is included in one of those cooperation forum configurations. The differences between SCO and the two that I've already described are that it meets every year. It was originally founded on security issues and wanting to have cooperation, especially to deal with cross-border, non-traditional security threats in Central Asia, but it is also expanded to include economic and political aspects. I want to shift gears a bit. So that's cooperation forums. We'll come back to this a little bit later. But I want to shift gears and talk about special envoys, which is another foreign policy tool that China leverages. So the reason for special envoys is for China to contribute to peace and security and to resolve what it perceives to be hotspots. The first one in these regions that it established was the Middle East Special Issues Envoy, established in 2002. And I won't go into all the details of this envoy, but basically it was set up for China to attempt to contribute to resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli and the Arab-Israeli conflict, broadly defined, by bringing together parties, by communicating with them, etc. So that was the first special envoy. The next special envoy was the special envoy for Africa, established in 2007, with the original purpose of contributing to issues in Darfur. And then over time, it has expanded, it's changed its focus. In the early 2010s, it worked a lot in South Sudan and other issues in the region. The next special envoy is an envoy for Syria, established in 2016. I am going to say a few more words about that because I think you may not be as familiar with why that special envoy was established. So China established a special envoy for Syria because it was concerned that the Syrian civil war could spill over into conflict more broadly into the region. It wanted to demonstrate it was a responsible power. And what I mean by this is, if you think back to 2012 and the double vetoes that China and Russia were engaged in the UN Security Council in relation to Syria, there was quite a bit of criticism and concern, especially from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and some of the other GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, about China's behavior in relation to that. So setting up a special envoy, although China didn't want to use the UN Security Council as a way to demonstrate its desire to contribute, this provided them an opportunity to show that they had an interest in resolving this issue. Another driver is that China has a worry about TIP, which is the Turkestan Islamic Party, and is an insurgency group within Syria that they were worried would provide material support to the Uyghurs. Another desire for China was to contribute to humanitarian aid in Syria, as well as to provide its companies an opportunity in a post-conflict environment for reconstruction of the country. And in general, what it's advocated for is a political solution, having a ceasefire, and utilizing all multilateral mechanisms that are at play. So the Geneva process, Astana, Vienna, etc. And these three envoys I look at in the book. China actually has started another envoy last year for the Horn of Africa. And so that's a new one that's not in the book, but just to flag for you that that also has been established. So, but I've talked in depth about those. I want to give you an idea of some of the other foreign policy tools, because then when we look at where these map in relation to convergence, divergence, cooperation, and competition, it'll give you a fuller picture. So on the economic side, I am assuming many of you are familiar with China providing state support for its companies in these regions, and that because of the sectors that China's involved with in these regions, you've got a particularly predominant role for state-owned enterprises and various levels of state support. And I've already made some comments about foreign aid, but obviously that's a major component of their interaction as well. But some things you may not be as familiar with are that China has been establishing special economic zones throughout these regions. And I'll list off, I won't do this for all the foreign policy tools, but this one I'm going to list off where these special economic zones are to give you an idea of kind of the range. So Algeria, Djibouti, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mauritius, Mauritania, Nigeria, Oman, and Zambia. And so what these are, China provides seed money to establish an industrial zone to encourage small and medium-sized Chinese companies to set up operations, with the idea similar to their own economic development model that you would have spillover effects into the broader economy associated with this. So that's one foreign policy tool. Another is that China's been pursuing free trade agreements. It has already signed one with Mauritius. It has been negotiating a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council since 2004. I would be happy in the Q&A to talk, if you guys are interested, to talk about why that hasn't actually been concluded. Is over time that the reasons have varied, but If they conclude that, then they will have a free trade agreement with the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, which is Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. They're also negotiating one with Israel as well as with Palestine. And so this would be an example where obviously Israel, they've got a significant economic interest in a free trade agreement, but having one negotiating with Palestine shows that they also are supportive of the Palestinians. And they have also expressed an interest in establishing a free trade agreement with the African Continental Free Trade Area, where if that one is concluded, then they would have a free trade agreement with the entire continent of Africa. So that's what they're doing on just some examples of a bilateral on the economic side. On the political side, outside of the cooperation forums and the special envoys, two things I look at are UN Security Council voting and strategic partnerships. So for UN Security Council voting, what I look at is differences in US and China votes over time. So in the whole post-Cold War era. And there's really only two issues where you see a difference in votes. One is over sovereignty. So this tends to be around sanctions, where China has a very long-standing concern with sanctions broadly, right? So that's one issue. The other issue is on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it really depends on what the resolution is, whether China's voting yes or the US voting no or vice versa. But those are really the only two areas. The other political foreign policy tool I look at are strategic partnerships. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but I just want to note for you, these are not alliances, these are not defense treaties. These are just an articulation by China and a partner country that they want to have robust political, economic, potentially security, but mostly political and economic relations. In the Middle East, they have established strategic partnerships with every major country except for Israel. And again, the driver behind this is not that it doesn't have strong relations with Israel, it does, but a lot of this tends to be around sensitivity of perceptions in the Arab world in particular, that they have one with every single one, as well as they've established strategic partnerships with the African Union, with the Arab League, and with the GCC, in addition to the bilateral. So if you think about it, they've got strategic partnerships with Iran and with Saudi and with UAE and with Turkey and with Egypt and with Morocco, and the list goes on and on. In sub-Saharan Africa, they've established them with all the major anchor countries, and I won't go through the whole list. There's a number in sub-Saharan Africa. You have over the last since 2015 seen an uptick in strategic partnerships. So that could be that this could be an interest of Xi Jinping and the current leadership to pursue these. It could be related to Belt and Road, but there has been an uptick. You have very broad-ranging strategic partnerships across these regions. On the military front, I look at several things. So one is United Nations peacekeeping operations. China has been involved since 1992. It has been engaged in a number of different operations, whether that be in relation to Sudan or Mali or Lebanon, et cetera, right? So that's one piece of their engagement. Another is conventional arms sales. And if you look over time from 1991 to today, the only time you see any sort of significant uptick in conventional arms sales was in the 1980s, when China was selling weapons to Iraq and Iran during the war between those two countries. But otherwise, you have relatively low levels of conventional arms sales. China has also been involved in anti-piracy operations off the Gulf of Aden since 2008. And in 2017, it established a base in Djibouti. That again, during Q&A, I'd be happy to answer questions about this, but China's narrative associated with why it wanted to establish a base was to be able to protect its citizens and businesses, to be able to evacuate them, to help contribute to the protection of sea lanes of communication, that they have growing economic interests, right? That they want to continue to participate in anti-piracy, et cetera. So that I would flag for you that base in Djibouti, before that was established, China had a very explicit no foreign basing policy. And although a lot of features in the South China Sea have quite base-like qualities, and we can debate regarding where they have bases now, Djibouti is the only declared overseas base that they have established. I next want to say a few quick words about Belt and Road. There's a chapter in the book about Belt and Road in Middle East and Africa. What I think is most important to keep in mind during this presentation today is that all the foreign policy tools I just described technically fall under Belt and Road, right? If you look at the cooperation forums, they frame themselves as being under Belt and Road. It's these different tools etc. So I see Belt and Road very broadly defined, and that you have seen a real shift in functional area, growing cooperation within Belt and Road in health, in digital, in space, in green technologies, etc. But again, during Q&A, happy to talk about other shifts in Belt and Road, but I would see that really more as an umbrella concept that would encompass all of the foreign policy tools that I just described. So what I want to do next is show you some graphs on where these map out in relation to competition and cooperation, convergence and divergence. So, and there's going to be bigger type on this in just a second. So this is from the book. So you've got at the top competition with the US versus cooperation, and then divergent from the liberal order. Another category that I included called norm neutral, because there's some foreign policy tools I looked that I would argue there's really not aspects of the liberal order that are particularly relevant, but they're included. And then convergent with the liberal order. I'm going to show you different slides that break this down. So the first one is that top piece. So on competitive with the US and divergent from the liberal order. So what falls into this quadrant? What you see is on the cooperation forums, the emphasis on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and sovereignty more broadly, and a lot of the unilateral economic engagement that I described, as well as China's foreign aid. Its special envoy for Syria and the degree to which it focuses on non-intervention. You've got government support for Chinese companies and UN Security Council voting on sovereignty, right? So these are competitive with the US and divergent from the liberal order. This next column is the middle on the norm neutral. So what I would put in norm neutral would be the special economic zones, the agricultural demonstration centers, which actually I didn't really talk about earlier. What agricultural demonstration centers are, it's across sub-Saharan Africa. There's many countries where China has established these, that the idea is to focus on one agricultural product, whether that be corn, rice, fisheries, etc., to work with the country to develop expertise associated with that and to offer opportunities for Chinese agricultural businesses to establish market share. But so these I would put in norm neutral. The strategic partnerships that I described, as well as China's base in Djibouti. Okay. And then this next piece is competitive with the US and convergent with the liberal order, right? And so there's several things that fall in here. One would be on the cooperation forums, the South-South cooperation that I described, as well as support for the Palestinians. And the reason I put support for the Palestinians in convergent with the liberal order is because China is advocating for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict more broadly to be resolved through United Nations mechanisms and through multilateral mechanisms to facilitate negotiations. On the economic side, in the cooperation forums, these are some things I didn't talk about in detail, but China is providing tariff-free trade to many of the least developed countries in these regions. And so that's very much in alignment with the liberal order. The free trade agreements I discussed would fall into this category. China's use of multilateral mechanisms for development finance, as well as its special envoys and the degree to which they advocate for the use of multilateral mechanisms. UN Security Council voting on Palestinians, again, because it's advocating for the use of the UN and multilateral mechanisms. Okay. And then on the cooperative with the US and convergent with the liberal order, this is where most of China's security behavior falls. So on security cooperation, I mentioned nuclear-free zones and anti-piracy and counterterrorism and peacekeeping operations. The special envoy for Africa, anti-piracy, the low conventional arms. So what this really boils down to is that overall, what you see when you take a step back again, is that you've got a real difference in functional area. In economic, political, and foreign aid behavior, China tends to be competitive, but some of that behavior is very much divergent with the liberal order, but some occurs very squarely inside the liberal order, right? And then on the security side, you've got the vast majority of security behavior is falling into this quadrant here, where it's cooperative with the US and the West, and it's convergent with the liberal order. Go to the next slide. So what I want to do is that was kind of high level. Again, really happy to talk about the details in the Q&A regarding this. But with all these foreign policy tools, how does China differentiate itself as a great power in these regions? So it portrays itself as a defender of sovereignty, a champion of development and South-South cooperation, a promoter of connectivity, an advocate for international institutions, a balanced actor that has positive relations with every single country in the Middle East and every relation with every country in Africa minus Eswatini that continues to recognize Taiwan. And it also emphasizes that it lacks a colonial history in comparison to the US and to Western powers. So at a high level, what are the findings of the book? I mean, all this that we just discussed. And what does it mean kind of more broadly for China's rise globally? So in these regions, China is not maximizing power, but it's also not entirely socializing into the liberal order. Its behavior varies across functional areas in ways that we've already discussed. It is building significant multilateral mechanisms, especially cooperation forums, for its interactions with these regions. And China's behavior in much of the global South outside of its own territorial perimeter is quite similar to what I've described in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at Latin America with CELAC, with the cooperation forum they have with the Caribbean and Latin America, right? Or you look at Eastern Europe, which that's an interesting one where over time, I think you guys know, it's going from more of a 17+1 to 15+1, you're seeing some frame there, but the cooperation forum concept is very similar, right? Or with Portuguese speaking states, et cetera, right? So, and these other foreign policy tools as well. In much of the global South, China's behavior is very similar to what I've described today. So thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to the comments and questions.
First, we have David as our discussant, so you can speak and then we'll open it up to Q&A. You can take the podium or you can sit there, wherever you like.
I'll stay here, but go on, suggest when you come to responding to what I have to say in the audience, maybe it's best if you go back up there. So people on the camera, you're on, by the way, can see you better. Okay.
Yes.
Well, listen, it's a particular pleasure to participate in this session and listen to Dawn's splendid description of her important book, China's Rise in the Global South, which you can see is this is what it actually looks like. A heavy book, 392 pages. Won't tell you the cost. All I can say is I hope Stanford University Press has the foresight to bring it out in paperback.
January.
Yes.
Paperback in January, and they just dropped the ebook price to $25 yesterday.
Wow.
So it is more affordable now.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, don't let that deter you from getting a hard copy either, folks, Christmas is not that far away. Planning for your relatives and loved ones. Anyway, no, seriously, Dawn, I have watched this project evolve over many, many years, 15 to be precise, thereabouts at least. It had its origins, if I recall, as a research paper you did in my Chinese foreign policy class on China and global governance 18 years ago, thereabouts. And then subsequent conversations we had about China's role in the global governance system, then rather nascent role. Here, fast forward 15 years, and it's advanced considerably and become far more complex, as you captured really well in the book. But then the topic morphed into a PhD prospectus, and then it made it through multiple drafts of that prospectus, and then it morphed into a dissertation, which had to be researched first. Went to both of these regions, to sub-Saharan Africa, to the Middle East, to Cairo, and to Beijing. She and I overlapped for a year at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. was there as a visiting scholar at the same time. So 2 to 3 years worth of field work went into this. And now, as I say, it's a full 392-page book from a very prestigious press, Stanford. So congratulations, really. Having read it countless times in its earlier dissertation iterations, and now having read the whole thing very carefully as a published book, I know just how far it has come and how much hard work and effort has gone into the meticulous research, the writing, and the final product. So very, very impressive. And congratulations. And it gives me, as your doctoral supervisor, a small degree of pride to see it come to fruition. We also have Professor Shin, who is on your PhD committee here in the audience. I'm sure he's just as proud of you. Professor Sutter is not here today. I think he's teaching class right now, actually. He too is on your dissertation committee. So we're all just really proud of you. Welcome back to GW. Where Dawn got her PhD here in 2012, I think. But what's interesting about in the dissertation was, of course, completed in 2012. We're now in 2023. And what's impressive about this is that Dawn has updated the data in the book all the way through to 2021. I was reading it yesterday, and there are some tables that are current through 2021. And there's a whole new chapter that was not in the dissertation on the BRI. BRI didn't exist when she was started off in this topic. So unlike a lot of people who do not really revise their dissertations very fully, into print, you did. You went the extra miles to bring this story forward. And it's a tremendous accomplishment. It fills in the Chinese foreign policy literature. It fills a very important gap. We don't have. We have case studies of China and different countries and different regions. This is a one-stop shop, minus Latin America. So looking for your next project. But really, and I remember when we were talking about your case studies, and I suggested to you that you look at the Middle East and Africa together rather than one or the other, just to try and find the divergencies or convergencies between those two regions, and was producing really interesting conclusions. Now, I'm not going to be a discussant in the traditional academic sense. I'm simply going to kick off the Q&A period with a few questions for you. I could ask you questions for the next hour, but I'll try and restrain myself. I guess I'll ask you two kind of current events questions and then one kind of deeper question about your thinking about China as a convergent, divergent, liberal, illiberal actor. But the current events questions are, were you surprised by the Iran-Saudi deal that the Chinese brokered? And what do you think it says about China's role in the Middle East going forward? Can we anticipate China's footprint and, mediating? This is a region of the world that needs a lot of mediation, right? And so this kind of caught the world off guard, this announcement. So what do you think about that? And secondly, current events side, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk that China wants to buy the silence of the Arab world on Xinjiang. So question, what tools precisely does China use to buy the Arab world's silence? And turned around to buy positive narratives about the BRI. And I'm sure you read the work of Maria Letnikova on soft power in Africa. But I don't want to ask too many questions. Forget about BRI for a moment. I mean, really, what does China do? I don't think it's special envoys and cooperation forums that buy silence. I could be very surprised. So what does China do to get the Arab world and Indonesia and other Islamic countries silent on the Xinjiang genocide question? Yeah, don't you?
These are two big questions. So first is on current events. And actually, fortunately, in October, I was over, I'm sorry. I was fortunately in October/November last year, I was able to go and do my first post-COVID field research in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates. So I was actually able to do some interviewing as this was occurring and in process, right? And so I think it's being seen as surprising in the media and analysis more broadly. I am not particularly surprised for a number of reasons. So one, that China, through the special envoys that I described, has been wanting to play this mediating role more broadly for a very long time. And increasingly, previously they saw the Palestinian issue as kind of the core of tension and conflict in the region, but increasingly they're concerned regarding Iran, Saudi, Iran, GCC type of tensions, right? And so, but I think really what caused the shift potentially is that China increasingly is willing to be seen more publicly as a mediator and wanting to take credit for its achievements, but a lot's changing with the countries in the Middle East more broadly. So what I was really seeing in my interviewing is that, for example, the United Arab Emirates is really, I think, reflecting on its relationship with great powers and is increasingly concerned regarding the US presence in the region in a post-Afghanistan withdrawal, and especially post the beginning of last year when there was a Houthi attack in Abu Dhabi that really, I think, shook the Emiratis in certain ways. And in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, you also, I think, have this reflection that's a function of that, but also is a function of worries regarding as administrations in the US change, that there's fairly dramatic shifts in US relations with Saudi Arabia. And so that, I would say it's kind of a linear progression of China's engagement with the region and wanting to be involved in these things. Countries in the region are increasingly wanting China involved and wanting to emphasize that they have other options. And so publicizing it in this way, that it came together. But this is, I would say, the first high-profile example of China bringing together regional rivals for this type of negotiation. So I think it's significant, but I think it's part of these much broader patterns that we shouldn't be surprised by, and we should actually expect to see more of this type of behavior. On the silence regarding Xinjiang, I think there's a number of reasons why they've been able to have relative silence, many root causes over time, going all the way back, historically, but especially since 2009, they've focused on this. So before the camps, before the human rights violations, this was a goal of theirs. So, one piece of this is that I do think, because Arab states in particular don't see the Uyghurs as being ethnically the same as them, because the Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic. That's in the Muslim world, you saw more critique, although not a lot, coming from Turkey, and more of a hit on public opinion polling in Turkey associated with China's behavior. But in the Arab world more broadly, many of the regimes didn't see that same affinity. I think another piece of it is that China has been relatively effective in its narrative associated with terrorism in the Uyghurs, which I would say is an exaggeration. It's, there's deeply problematic aspects of that, right? But I think the fact that they've tied it to these local security concerns has gotten traction. I think that many countries, especially in the Arab Gulf, do not want to have criticism from other countries of their own human rights behavior. They tend to, on some of these, UNGA, General Assembly resolutions, or other environments, they're going to vote in the same way as China anyway, in a way that supports China's position. Obviously, the growing economic and political clout, et cetera. So I think in some ways it's overdetermined, but what has been interesting to me recently, if you look at the last cooperation forum, the one from December, when I was doing interviewing in October and November, there was definitely, I think, a concern that there would be language inserted into the cooperation forums that were actually supportive of China's behavior in Xinjiang. And if you look at those documents for the very first time in the cooperation forums, you have a line that says that basically China and the Arab states respect each other's treatment of ethnic minorities. It's kind of veiled, but it's definitely a pro, a Xinjiang type of environment. So I think it's not, I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as buying, but I think they've been quite effective in having relative silence. And what disturbs me right now is that I think increasingly China's narrative that Xinjiang is something that's being exaggerated by the West and it's just being used as a political tool. I think that's starting to get more and more traction with countries in the Arab Gulf in particular. And so I think that the more that it seems it is interpreted as that rather than a very genuine concern on the part of politicians and US government officials and NGOs, et cetera, it's harder to get traction. And I think that the final thing is, I'm sure all of us remember before COVID, what was happening in Xinjiang was very much in the news. And the behavior has not dramatically shifted, but it hasn't been reported on, I would say, in the same robust way that it was pre-COVID. So I think there may be less pressure. Yeah, so lots of different reasons, but yeah.
All right, well, thank you. Let me just close my questions with one about your, the arguments of the book, have to do with the degree to which China's behavior in the global south is congruent with or not congruent with, divergent from the so-called liberal international order. That's the big elephant in the room, the big question this study really addresses in the global south, not an insignificant question or topic. You started off by saying in your presentation, China's seeking to advance an alternative international order, but does not seek to overturn the existing liberal international order. I was very careful how you worded that. But my question has to do with, you think we're back in graduate school, independent variables and dependent variables. So you argue in the book that if U.S.-China, the more stressed U.S.-China relations are, the more competitive, as you put it, the less congruent China's behavior with the LIO is. So the question is, given the extraordinary stress and competitiveness, which is pervasive in U.S.-China relations today, and indefinitely, I think, A and B, Putin and Moscow, the partnership, which they themselves term a comprehensive partnership of coordination. All China's 112 partnerships, strategic partnerships in the world, this is the only one that uses the word coordination. Coordinating against what, folks? Fill in the blank. United States liberal international order. So if that's the independent variable, we have a new independent variable, the China-Russia axis, and the other independent variable, the U.S.-China competition. Well, those are the IBs. If you're looking at the DB, China's role in the global liberal global order, one would hypothesize that we're going to see not so much, we're going to see major pushback and trying to overturn and tear down, one could hypothesize, not just create an alternative to, but really take down the existing liberal international order. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think there's many moving pieces to that. So one would be that I think even when I did this study before the events before 2017, obviously this comes up to 2021, but even before the really emphasized dynamic, the fact that China is much more comfortable with certain aspects of the liberal order than others, so that they're more comfortable with the economic side or even the security side, but that they are deeply uncomfortable with some of the political aspects. I think that was already straining the broader liberal order as they rise within it. And the reason I frame it as an alternative order is these cooperation forms and other tools. I don't think originally they were founded with the idea of displacing, or replacing the order, but they are founded on norms that China is much more comfortable with and shared interest with these regions that if the order goes away, that they would exist. But to your point, I think we're getting to this situation that as you have tensions between the US and the West and China over aspects of the liberal order, I think increasingly the liberal order as currently defined, being as all-encompassing as it is very much potentially moving towards a more limited liberal order that would include the US and the West, right? And so I don't even know if China has to destroy it for it to contract by the actions of, if you think about the US's current focus on autocracy versus democracy, and right? And I think there were a number of triggers, whether it be Xinjiang, but I think in some ways Russia's behavior may have been one of the final straws in this kind of shifting on what the liberal order even looks like in the scope. And then you put in, so let's say we go that direction. Many of the countries, especially in the Arab Gulf and in the Middle East, actually share China's discomfort with the political order. and with certain elements, right? So I think if you ended up with them having to choose sides on an order standpoint, they may be more comfortable in institutions that China's establishing. Africa, that Professor Shin looks at, I think is a more complicated picture, right? Because you have many other, regime types, et cetera. But so I think there's that piece. And then the Russia piece, I think adds a lot of complexity, because now you've got Russia not just threatening the liberal order, but threatening Westphalian sovereignty in a way that had not occurred before. And China, obviously it's a whole nother discussion, right? But China not fully supporting, but also not fully criticizing, is continuing to strain the US. So I think we are getting close to the point of a US-China kind of rupturing of relations potentially. This order becomes much more important. And as, incrementally, even though you can make arguments that trade between the US and China is higher now than it was before, and that you're not having a decoupling, the degree to which China, US, and China, Western Europe relations become strained, it does appear they're shifting their investment, their cooperation, their technological, cooperation, et cetera, is shifting to the global South, in particular into the Arab Gulf and into the Middle East. And so I do think you're seeing that shifting. And I think it's way too early to tell, but I think China increasingly is articulating its vision of order in ways that occurred after the book was written and already in press, right? So the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, there's not a lot of meat on the bones yet. And I think at this point, it's just an articulation of what China's been saying through all of these other foreign policy tools. But China is starting to articulate its vision, and does that become an alternative, a true alternative international order in the longer term has yet to be seen. But yeah, there's a lot of strain on the current global order.
Watch that space, as people say. We're seeing, I agree, not just a bifurcation, perhaps, of orders, plural, with the West, and then the China-Russia piece, but I would argue a trifurcation of global orders, and the battle spaces. Look, once on U.S.-China competition in the third world during the Cold War 1.0. We're in Cold War 2.0. So where's the competition? Global South. This is the battleground between the United States and China going forward, and the orders. So it's going to be interesting to see how this, because the Global South is anything but a united entity. And as you found in the 60s, the West will appeal to some countries in the Global South, and the East, if you will, Russia-China axis will appeal to others. And then there will be others who don't want others. The non-line movement folks, remember, are still with us. So I'll be quiet here, but this is just really fascinating stuff, and you've got a career to update this. I'll be quiet. Let's open the floor to questions from others.
Yes. Yes. I mean, or you can call on whoever looks interesting to you as well. But I would just say to people in the audience, if you are called on, please introduce yourself, your name, and your affiliation.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
My name is Steve, and I live here in Washington. And I have two questions for you. First is, what's the liberal order in your definition? And secondly, how does Taiwan play into China's, what it is you're discussing about China's Belt and Road Initiative? Thank you.
Okay, so liberal order at a very, very high level, when people talk about the Western liberal order, there's three kind of primary, well, there's four, there's multiple components, right? So one would be an economic order that's founded on economic liberalism, which includes free market, limited state involvement, and using international institutions to facilitate economic cooperation. So in a post-World War II environment, think about the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, those type of organizations and ideas, right? On the political side, it's about advocating for democracy and human rights, right? So it's a big part of the political order, and obviously encompassed within the United Nations in various ways. On this, again, I'm hitting this very high level, right? But on the security front, it tends to be ideas regarding collective security and facilitating security cooperation, again, through regional and international organizations for peacefully, you know, and using multilateral organizations to peacefully resolve disputes. So think about United Nations peacekeeping and those type of things. You also often, when you're talking about a US-led order, there's also the hub and spoke system on the security side. So what that's referring to is the US defense treaty with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as the bilateral military alliances in Asia. So that would be Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia, and Thailand. So that's another piece of the order. So again, but for each individual tool I talked about, there's different elements of the order, but at a high level, that's what I'm talking about in the order. In relation to Taiwan, really for Middle East and Africa more broadly, historically, I would say Taiwan was more of an issue back when the PRC and Taiwan were fighting for recognition. At this point, since there's only one country in all of Africa that continues to recognize Taiwan, and there's no countries in the Middle East that formally recognize Taiwan, I don't see it as a big active issue. More broadly. So I'll leave it at that. I don't tend to look at Taiwan a lot in relation to these regions. I think it's a much more active issue in Latin America potentially or other parts of the world.
So do you consider Taiwan part of China, or is it?
It's not relevant to the topic.
I don't research it because that's not part of China, Middle East, China, Africa relations.
Let's, there's a lot of people with questions, so let's.
Maybe I'll moderate. So this young man had his hand up.
Thank you very much, Professor. As you said in the speech earlier, that there was a barrier between the free trade negotiation of China and the Gulf countries.
Yep.
Would you care to elaborate on that?
Yes.
And also, would you say that this strategy of pivoting to the global south, because United States and many Western countries are trying to decoupling with China on the chip or high technology to sustain this economic growth and to maintain an export-oriented economy. Would you say this is a viable strategy for China to maintain this export-oriented economy?
How is that related to the global south and the topic of today's? I'm sorry, I don't follow the relationship between your question and her book.
Oh yes, because the China's rise in global south, if China can stress more on its relations with the global south, can it replace its trade relations with other?
I can speak to.
Okay.
I'll frame that. Yeah. So on the GCC. So as I said earlier, China and the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, have been pursuing a free trade agreement since 2004. So in the initial phases, arguably the reason why it wasn't signed was the GCC really hadn't engaged in many free trade agreements. So they were very new to these negotiations. It was taking a while. And then you fast forward and you come to the Arab Awakening, right? And during the Arab Awakening, you had real divisions within the GCC. If you think about Qatar, there was an embargo on Qatar, right? You didn't have enough unity within the GCC for them to get themselves together to be able to negotiate with China. Now that's calming down, right? You don't have the embargo on Qatar. You've got more unity in the GCC. So based on interviewing actually I was doing with the GCC leadership back this last fall, really a big part of the issue is that right now GCC wants to have market access into the PRC and wants to ensure that any free trade agreement that's concluded fully, is in alignment with their own interests. So that's really more the stumbling block right now, is the two sides coming together for a deal that has enough market access for the GCC countries. More broadly on your question about decoupling and shifting. So as in my response to some of Professor Shambal's comments, I was saying these regions are more important. Chips is a very specific issue, right? But I would say that especially in a post-COVID environment, you are seeing more and more technological cooperation in various ways, right? And some of this is follow-on effects after COVID. So think about kind of artificial intelligence and biomedical research and things like that are now happening in the United Arab Emirates and other parts of the GCC. Right? Or if you think about investment, even before COVID, you had some investment that was going to be coming into the US, but because there was deep concern among China investors about the climate in the US, that investment shifted to Israel, right? For some high-tech
type thing. So I do think you're seeing on the margins shifting, and that these markets, at least from a conceptual standpoint, China sees the large populations and the wealth in these regions, et cetera, as being true opportunities for their businesses in the longer term. So I do think you're going to see more and more of a focus on that, but it really depends what part of it's not that all parts of the global south are equally attractive for technological cooperation, right? That's going to tend to be countries that have a lot of money and a desire to come together with China on very specific projects. Thank you for the question.
Okay, gentlemen, back here, what's it all?
I'll confess, I've grown very wary in.
And who are you?
Oh, sorry, I'm Robert, I'm locally based, unemployed. I've grown very wary in the time since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, of the talk in this town about the liberal international order. I think it's fine in terms of framing certain questions of analysis, but I would caution against it in terms of it being the framing concept in terms of evaluation or policy making decisions as opposed to concrete particular interests. And the reason why I would, just to elaborate my skepticism briefly, I had a professor once who questioned the concept of culture, saying that it sort of suggested it's a sort of totalizing abstraction, it's a general abstraction that suggests a kind of overall coherence that's actually lacking. And I think the more apt description of the order of relations might be something like an evolving agonistic or conflictual dynamic. And we have a set of institutions, but there's not one. I mean, the UN has a kind of predominance, but it's not all encompassing. I was on the note of coordination, just to round up here. I'm reminded the original name of the CIA's clandestine service was the Office of Policy Coordination, answering to the Office of Policy Planning. And we've done a lot of things that are, illegal and criminal. I mean, obviously, with respect to Xinjiang, obviously our standing is very low morally in terms of because we just invaded.
Is there a question, Robert,
related
to the book?
It's a response to the book, certainly, because the book's framing concept seems to be the international order, and I'm just sort of trying to, I guess, question its relevance in terms of how we actually decide, in terms of how particulars are mediated in terms of interest.
So what I say about that quickly is the liberal order is not one thing, and that's part of why I was being careful in defining it in the way it talks. But from an academic standpoint, much of the international relations literature tries to look at rising powers in relation to order, broadly defined, where the liberal international order is part of that. And there are elements of international order that are naturally at tension, right? From an academic standpoint, sovereignty and aspects of liberal order can be at tension, right? So all of that this is an academic study. The political aspects are another piece, right? And that's but I am not speaking to policy in that way. I'm trying in a very academic way to look at very discrete elements of what could be considered liberal order from an academic standpoint and how China's behavior relates.
I think that's valid. I just say that, like you mentioned, Westphalia.
We have a lot of people who have questions, so please keep your questions brief. And again, the point is not to have an argument with the speaker, but just ask one question that she can reasonably respond to and move on to others.
Okay, so I'm going to actually take two questions at a time, beginning with the lady in the back and then gentleman right in front of you.
Hi, my name is Laurel Schwartz. I recently returned from working as a principal at a Canadian Chinese school in Beijing. And I also write for the China Project. I'm curious, with all of the, there's been a whole slew of proposed legislation coming from the Hill about a lot of prohibitions against China. And we also saw the US government in the past month or so having a lot of doing a lot of things to attract the global south, Vice President Harris's visit to Africa, the second annual Summit for Democracy. What I'm not hearing though from this town is any kind of a coherent message of what success would look like vis-a-vis China, particularly with garnering the attention of the global South. In your study, did you get any idea of what success will look like for the US if there has been any, vis-a-vis China, if there has been any kind of agreement on that?
I can answer that shortly.
Yeah.
No, that was not part of the study in the way that you're framing it, and I don't have anything to say on that.
Okay. Young man?
Hi, my name is Fan. I'm first year student at SIS, last year master student at SIS, and also former travel student. I graduated recently.
Great.
So my question is like, thank you for underlying this kind of foreign policy view like China has in its diplomacy right now. And my question is specifically about the debt crisis under the Belt and Road Initiative. Like we see the recent news like pumping up the Ghana after the Sri Lanka displays. Ghana is one of the big country in Africa right now, and you outline this kind of foreign policy views China have, right? Like, what do you think how like China play in this kind of things? Striking a balance with domestic, this kind of interest group, whether this kind of China export import, this kind of investment, kind of foreign policy investments. Another second broader question: how does your argument whether either support or challenge the traditional power cycle theory? This case, like your
Power cycle, Duran, Charlie, you can tell he went to science.
yeah, I'm glad
Charles
student,
Duran.
so I asked this question. Yeah. That's two questions, like more academic.
Okay.
Answer.
So on the debt trap, I don't look at those issues carefully, but my assessment of that more broadly, right? From a debt narrative, right? If you think about the Belt and Road being 150 plus countries, the number of cases where there appears to be potentially that type of behavior is a very small subset. And even the Sri Lanka case, when you pull back layers of it, it's a much more complicated story. So I would point you towards the work of Deborah Bodegam, China Aid Data. There's a number of researchers that are looking at this. But I would say the debt trap diplomacy narrative is exaggerated. That said, there has been a lot of lending, and with increased inflation, with a lot of other factors at play, there are many countries in the global South that owe China, as well as many other lenders, quite a bit right now, and that are in debt distress. So I'm not trying to minimize the issue of debt distress, but that's not something I look deeply at. But I think that if you're interested in that, again, if you look at Deborah Brodigan, if you look at Meg Rathmeyer, I'm saying her name, if you look at China Aid Data, even just over the last few weeks, there's other studies that are starting to come out that are looking at this. I think it's a very interesting issue, but I would just caution you, and this is something that I do from a US policy standpoint. I often say when I'm presenting or asked questions, I think the threat from China is not as much them using economic coercion towards countries in the global South. It is how attractive all of the things that they are doing and the soft power that they are gaining from the things they are doing right, rather than the things that they are doing wrong in those ways, right? So yeah, that's what I would say on that. On the second piece, on the power cycle theory, how would you say it interacts with? Because I probably have not read that theory in a very long time and am not as familiar with it. So if you have any ideas.
So you basically talk about like convergence to the liberal international order.
Yep.
Kind of things, like the power cycle theory basically talk about the balance of power, these kind of things. So can we elaborate on this kind of issue?
Say more.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe this is so I guess maybe the best way to say it is I'm not well positioned to answer because I have not led. If you want to talk about how it relates to Gilpin and some other parts of the literature, but that specific niche I'm not as familiar with.
Charles, I don't know if Charles Duran is still teaching at science.
yeah,
Is he? I took the course from him. So I won't tell you. Okay, Ashley and then Deepa. Ashley, you had a question? Have to identify yourself.
Hi, Professor Murphy. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. I'm Ashley. I'm an undergrad student in Professor Shamba's class. And I was just wondering, talking about the Saudi-Iran deal.
Yeah.
I guess China has indicated through its actions recently that it is willing to go after a divide and conquer strategy in parts like Europe and Southeast Asia. So I was just wondering, there are a lot of conflicts in the Middle East. I was just wondering why China chose specifically to merge two possibly important and powerful powers in the Middle East.
It's an interesting question because I do think that China looks at the Middle East and Africa a bit differently, obviously, than it does Southeast Asia. And that's why when I framed my remarks, I said outside of China's territorial perimeter, because I do think that the behavior is a bit different. And I think the reason they are in particular interested in this conflict is that they see that dynamic is causing instability in the region, and both sides are asking them to be involved. So I think that really is the driver. I don't think that, at this point, at least, having positive relations with all the countries, not trying to take sides, not trying to play one side off the other. I think up to this point, they've been quite nuanced in trying to ensure they had a balance in their relations, between different countries in the regions.
Jiva Lovely, City Center for Asian Studies. Dawn, I also knew you when you were a student here, and congratulations on a superb accomplishment. Listening to you, one of the things that you mentioned is the way in which in the security arena, or that there is more convergence rather than divergence, or more cooperation rather than competition. And so that it's kind of an interesting finding, although you're framing it within the liberal international order. What I think is interesting to me is, as you see China, the way it's expanding economically and making economic inroads, you go back to another region, Southeast Asia, where they have been able to do the economic inroads and leave the security arena kind of alone to the United States without becoming competitive in that realm, right? Because number one, it's very expensive thing to do. Number two, historically, overextension by big powers in the security arena, wars, what have brought them down. Do you think that China, given its long historical lessons learned and so forth and its past, do you see any possibility that it is learning that from the Americans and choosing an economic path that contains the influence and so forth, and perhaps an alternative economic order, political economic order, without disturbing or getting into the strategic security game, military game?
Yeah,
Is that possible?
So I think in Middle East and Africa in particular, they see that if they had unilateral, they're very cautious to have their military engagements primarily, other than the base in Djibouti, right? But primarily through UNPKO, through anti-piracy, multilateral, because they don't want to be seen as a military presence in the region. They see that picking sides or having military alliance potentially could pull them into conflicts they don't want to be involved with. They worry that if they start expressing preferences for internal kind of outcomes in various ways, that could make them more of a target. And I think, citizens and businesses. And I think one good example would be, I think it was in December, and it's Afghanistan. I don't look closely at Afghanistan, but you had a situation where you had a Chinese hotel that was bombed. Arguably, it was bombed because ISIS was concerned that China had too close of a relationship with the Taliban. So they targeted a Chinese hotel. And a few weeks later, you had an incident where the initial reporting was that there was a bombing in front of the Afghani Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time when a Chinese delegation was there, right? So this would be one example of the types of things that they're trying to avoid in Middle East and Africa. And then the other piece too is, the US is, at this point anyway, despite all of the discussion of focusing on Asia, et cetera, the US still is very involved in the Middle East, right? And China's not wanting to pick sides. So to your point is, I think China sees a world in which, at least for now, in the Middle East and Africa, they can be engaged without the military piece. And I would, back to your question on the joint statement, you guys really should read the joint statement, because on Saudi, Iran, China, China's not offering solutions. China's not offering security guarantees. I mean, you see a lot in the media right now about Saudi expects this or Iran expects this, and China, it's just natural for great powers that China will have to provide. There is no indication that they are providing anything, similar to what the US is to either side in these. So it remains to be seen how effective that approach will be. But I do think when they talk about being a mediator, they see it as we're bringing the sides together. We're not going to pick sides. We're going to get them in the room so that they can talk, but not them coming up with the actual solutions to the conflict.
Okay, so we've got 15 minutes left. We're going to try to get as many questions in as possible. So let's start with the gentleman here and then go to our commission and then make our way back.
Thank you. Senator Goes, I'm working with the Center for here with GW.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much for the presentation. So, you explained very well that China is pushing for its political economic agenda. I'm curious, my question is, what do we know about the local people reactions to Chinese agenda? Are there some surveys, some opinion polls, some research? Because I'm asking this question because I'm sorry, I don't work on Middle East or on Africa, but working a lot actually on China's engagement, economic engagement, and China's engagement, generally speaking, in Central Asia, China's influence. And we see, increasing reactions. So of course, on the one hand, some very positive reactions with people saying, okay, China is bringing a lot of economic investment involved in financing our infrastructure. But on the other hand, more and more people, thinking, okay, but these economic investments are not necessarily very positive. They don't abide by our laws, so on and so on. To the point that this growing xenophobic feeling are even having some influence on how the political authorities are dealing with China, despite the authoritarianism. So I was just curious to know what kind of reaction we had there in the Middle East, or in Africa, and what extent this influence. Sorry.
Don, you want to take this?
Real quick, I would point on this one. I would point you towards a number of surveys that are occurring right now. So Pew, BBC, Arab Barometer, Afrobarometer, as well as the Washington Institute is doing some really interesting polling within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right? So there's lots of, my work is looking at state to state, but there's a lot of interesting work that's being done that's looking at the questions that you're asking. And it really varies, elites, it varies by country, it varies by subset of society, et cetera. But those are the tools I would point you towards. Yeah.
Okay, you're partially one of my students over there.
Of course.
I'm Arash. Here at school. I'm a graduate. I'm in my question was about whether the liberal international orders, sort of displacement by China, or not displacement, but would be something like an alternative for the liberal international order. The setting up of an alternative by China. Do you see that, or should we see it as a threat or a challenge, or maybe an opportunity for cooperation? And just in case by liberal international order, I mean like the specific set of institutions set up by the US after World War II.
So there's a policy piece, there's an academic piece, and right. So let's take the next. I'll come back to you. I will answer your question fully, but let's get one more question and then I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Kadir. I'm client of theorize scholar here at IRS.
Okay.
And I'm working on Chinese foreign policy work in the Middle East. And nowadays I'm making the research. I'm making the research here on Uyghur diaspora organizations.
Got it.
Since a couple of decades, I realized that in our region, Turkey, other Eastern countries, and China is rising its influence. And I want to turn back to Professor Shamba's question of how they buy. So I'm looking to how they buy actually. But what I see, my first observation for data showed me there's an increasing investment and through AIIB especially. Yeah. If you look at this AIIB through your group, it's really an alternative to IMF and other kind of liberal world order. That was my question.
On the liberal order and the degree to which, if China has an alternative, I think this is it's something that I think the US is really grappling with more broadly right now, right? I mean, obviously, the current national security strategy that came out from the Biden administration makes very clear, and historically, the US has an interest in the liberal order. It amplifies US power. It's aligned with many of our economic and political values. So I think it gets very complicated to, as far as what that actual manifestation looks like, the degree to which it is threatening. But obviously, as China engages in coercive behavior, and it really depends what part of the order we're talking about, right? The treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang goes against US values in a way that has deteriorated the relationship. And sorry, that's seen as a threat to human rights globally, right? And there's certain aspects that are threatening. There's other pieces that may be concerning, but aren't necessarily threatening unless so I'd be happy to talk after the presentation more if you would like, but I think there's the policy piece and then there's the theoretical piece. And then a lot of it is really just how much do you think US power is reliant on being the hegemon in a liberal order that encompasses all of the countries in the world. And because I think you could make an argument that the US could be stronger if you had a more limited set of countries that actually bought into all elements of the order and that those were emphasized inside the order and then countries were able to operate outside of that. On the Uyghur diaspora, and so I think you've got to look at each institution like the AIB, right? I don't research that deeply, but I think arguably China attempted to set that up in alignment with broader norms, in a multilateral development financing, right? That was the argument from the beginning, and there's many ways in which it is. So when you look at projects that are being funded through the AIB, there's much more of a focus on sustainability and on a number of factors. But what they've done is they've shifted that most of the money isn't going through the AIB, it's going through the Silk Road Fund, it's going through the China Development Bank, it's going through the policy banks, it's going through the unilateral. So that's why on this chart, when I talk about going through multilateral development finance versus unilateral, but either way, on the buying for many of the countries that I'm talking about in the Arab Gulf, they're not the recipients of concessional loans. They're not, they have their own funding to actually pursue these projects and this cooperation. Really where development financing would be more important is countries that are lower income and that require that type of thing, right? And so, but again, this gets into, I think it's very, yes, the fact that there's heavy economic engagement and that you could risk that. I mean, we've seen with Lithuania, with countries outside of what I look at, China has chosen to use economic coercion, obviously towards Japan and Australia and other countries, right? But in these regions that I study at this point, I have not seen that, although there's always the potential with you in a symmetric relationship for that to occur.
Have you seen any concern about Uyghur problem in these countries?
So in my interviewing,
any official statement or like any Saudi Arabia?
Turkey has come out with some comments. And Ambassador Shen, I know, looks much more deeply, and I think on your new book have also looked at this as well. The next book I'm working on right now is more focused on Middle East, still looking at Africa. But in my most recent interviewing and past interviewing, the stance of most of my interviewees has been, yes, there's a deep concern on an individual level, right? But that concern is different from policy decisions that are being made. But as I said in my opening remarks or responses to Professor Shambao, I'm increasingly hearing from interviewees that, oh, well, the US is exaggerating Xinjiang. It's being used as a tool. It's, it's not, so I think the perception of that has been changing. At the beginning, there was a lack of knowledge, and then there was increasing knowledge and I think concern, and now you could be in a situation where they're buying into, for whatever reason, their own, are choosing to buy into Chinese narratives.
Okay, go to the back. Both of you gentlemen can ask your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Miguel. I'm a graduate student here at our school. So since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing Russia increasing its influence in the global south. And last month, Iran allegedly was responsible for the death of 9 Chinese citizens in the Central African Republic. So my question is, China and Russia going to be in direct competition for influence in the global south, or are they going to collaborate with each other to build an alternative world?
I think it's an interesting and important question. I think it's yet to be seen, right? Because the behavior, like for example, on the very limited amount that I've looked at that type of dynamic in Russia, in sub-Saharan Africa, Russia's behavior is quite different from China's behavior. Russia's more engaged on arms sales or actually having Wagner Group or other groups providing various security services, et cetera. I think right now they're coexisting in that space and don't see each other as a threat. But I think there needs to be a lot more research done on that to understand that dynamic. And then in the Middle East, many countries that I look in the Middle East have very good relations with Russia. So when I was off doing my interviewing, similar thing I was hearing was like, this Russia stuff is overblown. Why are we being criticized for this aspect of Russia? So they don't necessarily see the competitive dynamic between China and Russia in the region.
Very good question. Yes, sir.
My name is Ken Scabbat from Margaret Corporation, Japanese private company.
From what?
Japanese private company.
Okay, yeah, great.
I'm interested in the response from the recipient country. Get a lot of Chinese foreign aid or cooperation. Not only as a country, but if you have any, could you share with us about the example from the local community and local government? I mean, so the Chinese foreign aid on the community or local government. If you have any explanation.
So again, my work at this last book looked much more at the elite level. There's a lot of good work that's happening in that space on China aid data. I don't know, Ambassador Shin, if your next book is covering that and any level of detail, but Ambassador Shin has a book coming out from Colombia in November. In August? Okay, very soon. But there's a lot of good work that's being done on that. Stella Holm at Harvard also is doing some good, there's a lot of good work on that, but it varies so much by country, by project, by locality. It really, really varies. And so I'm gonna sidestep that question. Yeah.
So I'm looking at the clock. I think we have time for one more question. So we'll give it to someone who hasn't already asked one yet. I think it's fair. So very, very, very bad. And then
I am international finance. My question is about things that are fascinating. My question is about the takeaways from your talk that Professor Shandal mentioned as well, which is that when China is operating an alternative to the liberal order, but not actively seeking to overthrow the order, I was wondering if you had a sense from your study of what circumstances might make that change and what like actions the U.S. taking might cause them to start actively starting itself. For example, similar to how Russia started asserting itself. For example, actions in Taiwan, where a populist president starting a trade war. Thoughts on how that sort of cooperative friendship could sort of change into a more relationship.
So I think I truly think it's too early to tell, and I think it's a very fluid situation. And to Professor Shambal's point, and there's a degree that we see just weekly and monthly. I think we're all quite surprised at some of the activities in that realm. But I would say at this point in the regions that I study and more broadly, China and Taiwan is a special case that I'm going to leave out of this, right? But China has not violated the sovereignty of a internationally recognized state in the international system in the way that Russia has. China, although we can have all kinds of debates about China's influence and things like this, China has not been violating sovereignty so of the norms of the international system. On the liberal international order, I think they may be aligned in some of their interests. On the norm of sovereignty, I actually think China still has a very deep interest in maintaining that norm, and that a lot of the back and forth it does on these issues, if you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization last summer or last fall, some of the statements coming out when Putin said, we understand that China has concerns about this or that, I mean, that arguably was as a result of countries in the SCO and countries in the global south more broadly pushing back against China because it has this narrative of sovereignty, 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 but then it's not criticizing Russia for its behavior, right? So I don't think we're at a point of them dramatically shifting away from this, because it's in their own interest to maintain sovereignty. And it's part of their much broader kind of legitimacy and narrative with large parts of the world. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone in the audience again for attending. We're getting near the end of the academic year, but in what's left of the academic year, there's still a number of SEGR events that we have coming up, including a major conference on Taiwan on May 12th, and several other key events related to Taiwan, Japan, and other parts of Asia. So please keep your eyes open for those. And please join me in thanking Professor Murphy for her excellent talk, and Professor Shambaugh.
Well done.